yesterday. And our sympathies, of course, go out to those Afghans who suffered, as well as to the Afghan people who have been struggling with the problems of insurgency and terrorism now for many decades. All the same, I think it only brings the conversation that we're going to have this morning into sharper focus, because the absence of the problem in the national debate does not signify any diminution of its significance, both for the Afghan people and for US policy going forward. I want to, on your behalf and mine, extend a special welcome to our panelists this morning. We have a great panel, 3 US ambassadors, Ambassador Salme Khalilzad, who was our ambassador to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to the United Nations, and is now the president of Griffin Partners, a public policy firm in Washington. A special welcome to Dan Feldman, who was the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the State Department, and is now a partner at Aiken Gump, a law firm in Washington. Welcome, Dan. And of course, a special welcome to my old colleague and co-conspirator at Carnegie, Ambassador Hussain Khani, who was formerly Pakistan's ambassador to the United States and is now a senior fellow at the Hudson Institution. Hussain and I actually had the pleasure of publishing the very first Carnegie product many, many years ago when I came to this institution. And last, but of course not the least, I want to welcome Jeff Eggers, who worked with me on this paper and was the co-author in every sense of the word, both for the paper and for the project that led up to it. So very special thanks to Jeff, and I hope this will be the first of many things we do together at Carnegie and elsewhere. In a few minutes, I will yield the floor to Jeff so that he can begin the conversation with our guests. But before I do that, I want to just spend a few minutes walking over some of the key themes of the paper. I'm not going to regurgitate in any detail the minutiae and the manuscript, but I want to reprise some of the key themes for the benefit of those of you who haven't had the chance to look at it before this morning's conversation. I think it's commonplace now to state that Afghanistan is the longest war in America's history. Very often that proposition comes laced with a sense of burden. And those burdens obscure the fact that after 17 years of war, much has actually been achieved in Afghanistan. The state has been reconstituted. The Afghan armed forces have become a national institution, and the Afghan economy has begun to enjoy slow, but nonetheless positive growth. And that's a testament to both American and Afghan contributions over the last decade and a half. Having said that, however, there's still much that is at risk in Afghanistan. Political weaknesses are pervasive, both at the apex of government and throughout the country. The economy is struggling, and especially so after the international withdrawals in the last few years. And the Taliban insurgency continues undiminished. And we saw evidence of what the insurgents could do in Kabul yesterday. In this context, a critical issue is what will US policy towards Afghanistan be going forward? Much of the debate has really been about the numbers of troops that are present in country, the numbers of troops we ought to send to Afghanistan, and of course the costs of the campaign. But unfortunately, there's been very little discussion about what our objectives ought to be in Afghanistan going forward. The report that we have done is really intended to bring the issue of objectives back to center stage. And in the report, the key argument that we make is that US objectives going forward must really focus on protecting the gains that have been achieved in Afghanistan so far. And toward that end, we ought to consciously redouble our energies towards seeking a political settlement. This might seem counterintuitive and outside the pale of the times, but let me just spend a few minutes telling you why we argued towards that conclusion. It was a core presumption that underlay the work in this report. And that presumption was that both the Trump administration and the international community are unlikely to make the contributions necessary to secure either a decisive military victory in Afghanistan or pursue an open-ended conflict for as far as the eye can see. We also presumed that a complete disengagement from Afghanistan would be disastrous. If these were the two bookends within which policy has to be made, the unlikelihood of a military victory, the unsustainability of an open-ended conflict, as well as the perils of complete disengagement, then one was left with no alternative but to start thinking about some kind of a political settlement, with the only issues remaining to be resolved pertaining to the circumstances of the settlement and the terms of the settlement. We also thought that the present moment was potentially favorable for exploring this possibility because of the likelihood that US troop strength would be increased, however marginally, that the administration was likely to provide enhanced authorities for combat support to the Afghan National Security Forces, and that the international community could be convinced to sustain its support for Afghanistan so long as there was a strategy that looked seriously at the possibility of ending the conflict. Of course, if any of these variables were to change, the likelihood of the possibility of reaching a settlement, especially a settlement on favorable terms, becomes either harder or impossible. But we thought that this was a moment where one at least ought to try. Now, having said that, just because a settlement has attractiveness and might even be the virtuous evolution of this conflict, doesn't imply that a settlement is possible. If the Taliban come to the belief that the United States is exiting Afghanistan irrevocably, or that a military victory remains within their reach, their incentives to engage in a settlement obviously decrease. Consequently, the paper emphasizes a two-track policy for the administration. And the two tracks are strong continued support for the Afghan state, coupled with a revitalized effort at seeking or exploring some kind of reconciliation. The objective of sustaining support for the Afghan state is really in order to build a viable Afghan national security force that, at least in the near term, can help arrest the loss of territorial control and give the government some of the bargaining chips required should a settlement become possible. And the objective of revitalizing our efforts at reconciliation are aimed at making a settlement the targeted objective of policy rather than simply the incidental effect of other policies that we pursue in Afghanistan. To make this happen, we flag 6 specific things that the United States ought to consider in concert with its Afghan partners. First, we do need a unified civil military strategy that we argue ought to be centered on an empowered US ambassador in Kabul, because a policy of this complexity and magnitude cannot be managed remotely from Washington. Second, the United States ought to consider becoming a direct participant in the conversation with the Taliban. We cannot maintain the fiction that this is not our war. It's purely an Afghan war with the Taliban. The third is we ought to encourage our Afghan partners to engage in a national dialogue with all constituencies in Afghanistan to explore what the terms of a possible settlement could be. It's not a settlement, of course, that the United States can impose on Afghanistan. It's a settlement that has to grow organically from the preferences of the Afghan people. Fourth, we ought to take seriously the possibility of targeting the Taliban Shura in Pakistan, because as long as the Taliban leadership believe that they essentially have an unimpaired sanctuary the incentives to engage in a conversation with the Taliban or the United States are really minimal. Further, we have to press Pakistan on the sanctuary itself, because Pakistan, certainly in its own self-interest, ought to find a solution to the Afghan problem that mitigates its security challenges, not exacerbates them. And the best way forward is really to think of a partnership with Afghanistan rather than with proxies that challenge the Afghan state. And finally, we have to revisit regional cooperation towards Afghanistan. But regional cooperation is really a lagging variable, not a leading variable. You will not get a solution in Afghanistan through regional cooperation. But if the United States has a sensible and understandable policy towards Afghanistan, it is possible to bring together the region to support some kind of settlement. Having said all this, I want to end with a word of caution. This report is not the last word on US policy towards Afghanistan. This is a report that is intended to shape the debate at this moment. We have to come back based on what the administration chooses going forward and based on what happens in Afghanistan, if these policies are implemented, to re-examine whether the premises on which these recommendations are based are sensible enough. But that's work for the future. For the moment, we believe we've at least laid out a framework for thinking about the problem and some ideas that hopefully will help us exit the logjam that we currently find ourselves in. So with those words, I want to yield the floor to Jeff to carry this conversation with the distinguished panel we have. Thank you, Jeff, for doing this.
Thank you, Ashley, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Carnegie. It's good to see a full room here, and it's particularly nice to have such an exceptional panel. I look forward to a great conversation. I don't think the next 50 minutes of hearing from them and then another half an hour or so of hearing your questions is going to go slowly. I think this is going to go very quickly. It's going to be very interesting. Obviously, Afghanistan's making news in Kabul today, as Ashley mentioned, news of a bombing. But Afghanistan hasn't made a lot of news in Washington. There was some expectation that the president's visit to Europe and the NATO summit last week might culminate in some sort of policy announcement, and yet it was more about trade and Article 5 and so forth. And we're led to believe through our sources in the media that the administration continues this debate. So I want to put it to our panel, many of whom know this issue quite intimately. If you were sitting not here with us at Carnegie, but in perhaps the Oval Office or the Situation Room, given that this administration is debating the policy now, what would you advise President Trump at this point in time? Who'd like to start? We'll just give them 5 or so minutes to kind of give this policy counsel, and then we'll go into some questions. Zal, please.
Well, first I want to thank Ashley and you and Carnegie for doing the report, for the meetings you had before the report was published, and for convening this meeting. I think Afghanistan deserves more public attention and debate here than it has received or has been receiving in recent time. And so therefore, this is in itself a contribution. Second, on the sad day for Afghanistan and for all of us concerned about the issue of terrorism, I want to offer my condolences to the Afghan people and to all who have been affected by this terrorist barbaric bombing that took place. Estimates are that as many as maybe over 300 may have been injured, and perhaps as 80 or so people may have been killed, mostly civilians by all accounts so far. But there is a fog of war, so the ultimate reports may be different. Now, with regard to the Oval Office, I think when we have a new administration, it's on an issue as important as the way Ashley described it, with which I agree. You have to look at both objectives and strategy. The objective that you inherited, do they remain valid? Do you revalidate it, or do you change the objective? And do you, if you validate the objective, there's strategy in need of adjustment or change. Or if you embrace new objectives, then what is the implication for a strategy? And I believe that we haven't had, I don't know about inside the administration, although I'm aware of the kind of debate that there is, but about the whole set of both objectives and strategy. It seems that the focus, both publicly and maybe inside, is on troop numbers and is the or the troops the answer. And I believe that that is the wrong way to think about it. Troops are important, and I will say a word or two about the logic of having some additional forces being sent to Afghanistan. But I believe that precluding the objective that we have had, Afghanistan being a sanctuary for terrorists with reach to the United States that would target the United States, that's the objective that we had embraced after 9/11, should that remain valid? I think it should remain valid, the way to do it is either through a military victory or enough progress that leads to a negotiated settlement that Ashley has described. And I believe that we have always said that ultimately there has to be an end to this war, and the war could end with a negotiated settlement. In fact, President Karzai often mentions that he was told by President Obama that we don't regard the Taliban as such an enemy, and therefore a negotiated settlement with the Taliban is an option that we would like to see pursued. And President Trump has spoken much more negatively about the Taliban publicly, as he did on Memorial Day, where he described them as the enemy of all of civilization. But that doesn't mean that the goal of seeking a negotiated settlement is abandoned. So the question is, given where we are, where perhaps with the too rapid a withdrawal of U.S. forces to a lower number, the balance that's shifted on the ground in Afghanistan in the last couple of years. Let's remember that the Afghans have taken responsibility for the fight. Our role is in support of them. That's a big change. For some of us, like myself, who was involved in Afghanistan right after 9/11, in the current period, there was no Afghan institution called an Afghan National Army. And so the fact that now Afghans are taking on the fight, paying a very high price for taking responsibility for the fight, I do believe that the deterioration in the balance needs to be addressed with additional support, both in terms of numbers and in terms of the authorities that the commander has. I'm actually surprised that already some of the authorities that should have been delegated to the commander may not have been delegated yet. That should happen, and should happen very quickly, in my view. And the issue with regard to numbers that needs to be resolved. And I, for one, would not question the commander's recommendation, who has said that in order to prevent deterioration and shift the balance against the insurgents, he needs 3,000 to 5,000 additional forces. But that's not, in my judgment, inconsistent with the desire for a political settlement, because the 3,000 to 5,000 plus more authorities, plus enablers, including the air power, I think can, I haven't looked at it in great detail, but I can, I do believe that it can arrest the deterioration in the balance against the government. And that provides the context, the environment in which you can more seriously pursue negotiations. Two things in addition before I stop. One is that as long as the Taliban believe, or the other groups, and then the situation is complex. It's not only the Taliban, now we have the ISIS problem. That the time is on their side, that they are winning, that the balance is continuously shifting in their favor, their interest in negotiation diminishes, especially if any kind of negotiations that, as Ashley said, preserve the successes that has been achieved, the gains that have been achieved. So the stalemate has to be one that doesn't deteriorate against the government. If it's a stalemate that perhaps deteriorates against the other side, would be even better. That's one, in my view. It makes negotiations more likely than if they thought they're winning. Second issue is the issue of sanctuary that and I believe this is one of the most important issues as to why the war has dragged on. I mean, there are issues internal to Afghanistan, perhaps we will get to that, to the government, to the political elite, the divisions, the kind of limitations in terms of progress on rule of law. I mean, there is corruption. We can talk about all of that, and those are important issues. But my judgment, the key factor for why this war has gone on for as long as it has is the issue of sanctuary. When insurgents have a base outside, when the leadership can live in safety, when they can get trained, when they can recover, when they can go to hospitals when they get injured, when they can get resources, financial, it's much harder and it takes a lot longer to defeat such an insurgency if that wasn't the case. So if I was advising the Trump administration, I would say that not only you have to review the Afghan circumstances, what the issues are, not only the military issues with regard to how you make sure things do not deteriorate, but how do you resolve or deal with the sanctuary issue. And I, for one, believe that we need to put both a lot negative, such as the steps that Ashley recommended, saying we do not accept that that the sanctuary is a sanctuary as far as we are concerned. If we and our Afghan allies get attacked from a base or by groups that have bases on the other side, that we do not regard that to be a safe haven, that we should treat as safe haven and therefore not to go after them. And we even, under President Obama, we went after one of the leader, Mullah Mansour. So, but I would take additional steps, and perhaps we will get to that, on the negative side. But I would also put a lot more positive things on the table with Pakistan, should it cooperate. I think Pakistan has legitimate interests and concerns in Afghanistan. They need to be addressed. They need to be talked about. I've always said to my friend to the left here, he should be on the right, actually. Yeah, but the audience is that way. But that, he knows more than anyone else, because Pakistan did communicate in a couple of papers to the U.S. government its concerns about Afghanistan. Those papers need to be made public. So that one can see what their concerns are, if those papers contain their real concerns. So we should, and the Afghans should, engage on legitimate Pakistani concern. And Pakistan is an important country, and it's in our interest to have a reasonable, good relationship with it. But how do we incentivize Pakistan to do so? So, Mr. President, in the Oval Office, do you accept the goal of precluding a return to terrorists in Afghanistan who can reach the United States? And those are, we can name them, which groups they are. We have regard the Haqqani network as a terrorist group. The Haqqanis are a deadly element in the kind of combination that target Afghanistan. They are based in Pakistan. Taliban are an extremist group headquartered in Pakistan. ISIS is more complex. The more space that has been created by our too rapid a withdrawal, and by having inadequate numbers of forces based on what the commanders say, the problem has gotten worse. Now, one last point, and I'm sorry I've taken too long. The question is that some say this has taken too long. How long are we going to do this for? If you do not abandon the objective, which we could debate, should we embrace some other set of objectives? But if you do not, what options do we have? Is there a better alternative to strengthening the Afghan state? I know the administration and during the campaign, like it happens all the time, I have been a part of a couple of campaigns where this was an issue, that we don't do state building, we don't do nation building. But in some circumstances, that's the best option, unfortunately. Because if a piece of territory is strategically important for solving a problem that is important, you really have either you coexist with the problem in that strategic space, or you solve it, you occupy it, prevent what you think is undesirable, or you help locals do it. And I think through the two administrations, I think Bush and President Obama, we have managed to build some institutions that they have taken the fight on. Our casualties, I wish they would be zero, but they are very small. The costs are much lower financially than they were at times. Perhaps they can be made lower through more effective burden sharing. We haven't talked about that, what allies can do. Where I would put more emphasis than perhaps have been put at times in the past, given that all that I have said, is a really sharp look at the issue of how do we engage with Pakistan, how do we influence, shape Pakistan's trajectory, what does it take? Because if Pakistan continues on the path with regard to sanctuaries that it is, it's going to be very hard to resolve this issue in any meaningful way in the immediate future. It will take a long time to harden the Afghan state to the degree that it can protect all of its territory and can withstand efforts at kind of people coming who are based in Pakistan to create difficulties here. So it's a big challenge. I'd like the administration to make a deliberate decision, not to make a review that it isn't really confident in, that it would have to review it again in a year, as it has happened at times in the past. So I am not, sooner may be better, but a good deliberated strategy would be even better than it being sooner. So, but the administration does face big questions. So that's where I come down.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Khalilzad's prescription, revalidate the foundational objectives, additional troops to reinforce a deteriorating security situation, and a bit of carrots and sticks approach to address the Taliban sanctuary in Pakistan.
A lot more carrots and sticks.
Okay.
Not a bit more.
And we will get more into that. Let's go to the audience's right and give Ambassador Haqqani a chance.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me just say that Jeff and Ashley, both of you, I am very grateful for you bringing me back to Carnegie, where I first arrived in 2002 and started my life here in Washington, D.C. In my first exile. And I wasn't being rude when I was looking at my iPhone. I was actually searching for a piece I recalled I did while I was here at Carnegie. And I found it. And it was published by the Center for American Progress because the New York Times turned it down, the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post turned it down. They all thought it was too pessimistic. And this was published on the 12th of December 2003. And it was titled A Forgotten War. And it began with the words, 2 years after the US dropped its first bombs over Afghanistan in President Bush's global war against terrorism, the Taliban are reportedly regrouping in the lawless tribal region straddling the Afghan-Pakistan border. Then I went on to explain how the Taliban will become a problem, etc., etc. Nobody believed me at that time, obviously, which is why it was on a website of the Center for American Progress and not in the major newspapers. I wish people had read it and taken it more seriously. That was just a blurb so that you know that what I say comes with some understanding of the region, which is not always understood in Washington, D.C. At that time, even Zalmay Khalilzad was not on the same side as me in terms of understanding the situation. And I hope that it won't take me 14 years to persuade Dan Feldman of the same hard facts that I'm talking about. So here's what I'm going to say to President Trump if I get a chance to walk into the Oval Office and talk to him. I understand that it has to be short, and here's how I will begin. I will say, I will begin by saying, Mr. President, you more than anybody else in this room knows that it is sometimes not possible to get a divorce unless you are married. You have to say that to till death do us part, to be able to get to the point where you can actually say, now I'm invoking the prenup. And that is how Afghanistan works. The only way the US will be able to get out of Afghanistan is by saying we have no intention of getting out of Afghanistan. The more you have these timelines, and by the way, Dan might recall in my last days as ambassador, there was this talk was going on, that was 2011, talk was already going on about, how we can have a timeline for withdrawal. And I said, whatever else you do, don't give a timeline. And the reason is because Mullah Umar's famous words, we have the time and the Americans have the watches. So I said, all you are doing is by giving a deadline, you are making them use the stopwatch feature of their watches, of your watches, and they understand that. So all they know is they're going to wait you out, and you're just telling them how long they have to wait you out. The more you commit, the more likely it is that you will be able to get out. So that's one thing that you have to understand. Second, you can't build a future without understanding the past. You have to understand what has happened in Afghanistan over the decades, perhaps over the centuries. Afghanistan may have mineral resources, but those mineral resources are going to be extracted by multinational corporations only once that country has peace. Right now, every protagonist in Afghanistan is going to end up being subsidized by somebody or the other. The Taliban are subsidized. They are armed, trained, equipped, funded by someone. You know who that someone is. I don't have to identify it for you. So you have to understand that whoever is going to fight the Taliban will also have to be subsidized. And whether you want to do it or not, you have to understand it will have to happen, otherwise the Taliban win. All wars end in a political settlement. So Afghanistan is not going to be different. However, the Taliban are not normal actors. The Taliban have a different worldview. In their worldview, time is not of importance. Worldly goods are not of importance. They have been ideologically indoctrinated a certain way. They are willing to give up a lot more. Anybody who is willing to blow himself up does not think the same way as those who fight to protect the lives of their children and their family. It's a different worldview. So understand that negotiating them is not going to be like negotiating with other groups, insurgent groups, and other nations that you have engaged with. With the Soviet Union, with the communists, they at least were as materialistic as you might have been, and so incentives could have worked. These people have a different worldview. So yes, there should be negotiations, but bear that in mind. The way to get them to negotiation is when they feel that the consequences of not negotiating are going to be even worse than the fight that they are fighting. The same goes for their sponsors and supporters. There is a presumption in Washington, D.C., which we might hear again today, that, Pakistan does not yield well to pressure. And by the way, an aside here, I think that this panel would have been better served if an official representative of the Pakistani position was also here. Because, I mean, I am on the outs on that one. It's very difficult for me to say Taliban, Taliban, what Taliban? You know, which is what Pakistan's early response was. Sanctuary, what sanctuary? And I'm not in that camp, so therefore I'm the wrong person, at least for that perspective. The fact remains that Pakistan does have a view on Afghanistan. And I agree with Ambassador Khalilzad. Pakistan's legitimate concerns about Afghanistan must be addressed. Afghanistan should not be allowed to become a safe haven for negative operations against Pakistan. Pakistan has had this fear for a long time that the Pashtuns of Pakistan and the Baluch of Pakistan can be instigated from Afghanistan. But the fact of the matter is that history also shows that Afghanistan refused to play that role. Even in the 1965 and 1971 wars, when Afghanistan was very close to India, Afghanistan ended up siding with Pakistan in the wars. It did not create the pincers. So to my Pakistani friends, I've been saying it for a long time, hasn't had any effect, that maybe it's an imaginary fear that India will come and create a base. But to protect Pakistan, maybe there can be an agreement guaranteed by international powers that Afghanistan will not be home to Indian troops. That's understandable. That Afghanistan will not have any huge intelligence bases. But that's not what Pakistan has now ended up making its policy around, because there are no Indian military bases in Afghanistan. There are 4 consulates, but Pakistanis have said many times that there are 44 consulates. So if anybody exaggerates the threat by a factor of 11, then they really need to be dealt with by subtracting that factor of 11 and telling them, hey guys, we understand you have genuine concerns, but imaginary concerns we can't deal with. And lastly, if Afghanistan is to have so yes, you can talk about reassuring Pakistan, but no one can reassure someone who exaggerates the threat by multiple factors. There is no proxy war in Afghanistan going on right now in which Pakistan has to defend itself against an Indian proxy. Who is the Indian proxy? This is not the civil war of the late 1990s in which there were allegations that the Indians and the Russians supported the Northern Alliance. The only other power other than the United States and NATO, which are militarily openly present in Pakistan, the only country that has a covert operation in Afghanistan of any magnitude is Pakistan. And now Iran is interfering, etc. But all of that can be shut down only by being realistic about the threats, not by acknowledging and accepting just because somebody says I'm threatened, exaggerate those threats. That said, we have to come to the issue of the military posture. Look, the militaries, Mr. President, take many years. You have General McMaster here, you have other people here in this room. These people took many years to become generals. You don't become a second lieutenant one day and then in 10 years get promoted to general. So you will have to wait for Afghanistan's military to have that 20, 30-year period when there will be an esprit de corps and when the Afghan units will be sufficiently strong to be able to take on a rival that has the best military planners helping an insurgent army which is expendable to them. It's a very easy thing. You know, usually military men, when they are planning, they think about how many people will we lose. But when you have a ragtag bunch of radically, ideologically motivated people, then you don't have to worry about losses. So it's a no-loss war from the point of view of Pakistan's GHQ. That's why it has dragged on for so long. And so you have to help the Afghan military come to that level where it can sustain itself and be strong enough. And then comes the question of what do you do with Pakistan? My humble submission there is start by understanding what Pakistan wants. Stop indulging fantasies like Pakistan will help broker a peace with the Taliban, because if it wanted to, it could have done it in all these many years. All it has to do is round up all the people. When the current leader of the Taliban was elected, he was elected in Peshawar. All the Taliban leaders showed up to elect him. Well, they can do the same exercise, round them all up for instead of electing a leader, for electing a team of negotiators. The fact that that hasn't happened means that it's not going to happen. So in this report, one of the best suggestions is try to talk directly to the Taliban. However, there will be problems there, and in the end, you may end up having to talk to individual commanders, peeling them away from the main body of Taliban. And be prepared for new splinters to emerge. What is ISIS in Afghanistan? They call themselves the ISIS in Khorasan. ISIS in Khorasan is essentially a splinter of the Taliban. What is the Haqqani network, which has stolen my family name to my great dismay? They are basically the Zadranis, as you know. Jalaluddin Haqqani is from the Zadran tribe. He adopted the name Haqqani because it literally means the righteous, and that's why his sons now have the name. It's not his family name. That's an important aside for people to know. Of course, nowadays the ISI always talks about destroying the Haqqani network, but they usually mean me and my friends rather than the network run by Siraj Haqqani. So I think those will be the elements, the crucial elements of American foreign policy towards Afghanistan. Number one, help the Afghans get a strong military and stay there as long as it needs to be done. Of course, one understands, not waste your money, but do it methodically and with the support of Europeans and others. Second, stop giving deadlines and stop showing anxiety to leave. You will not be able to leave the more anxiety you show, and you will get less cooperation from the Taliban, potential Taliban negotiators and groups that might peel off from the Taliban, and also from the Pakistanis. Third, have a frank conversation with Pakistan, but understand that conversations in Islamabad are not the same thing as pressure. Many times Americans say, oh, we've pressured them enough. No, pressure means something that makes the other change their behavior. Just because some American diplomat went and got a little testy and said, you guys aren't doing this, and the other side said, no, what? It's not even happening. That is not pressure, with all due respect. So you have to figure out how to do that. And I agree, it has to be both incentives and pressure, but you have to understand what do they really want. And the longer you believe mythological fears, the more you prolong them. And finally, you have to have a political settlement in Afghanistan, but to do that, you have to be much more aware of the political actors and what they're really doing. Don't let them act as school children who come in and complain about each other to the teacher, but at the same time, so don't get too meddlesome in Afghan domestic politics, but at the same time, don't just keep throwing money as the solution. Lastly, nation building, state building. Look, one of the reasons why Afghanistan has become so complicated is because everybody who was trying to help Afghanistan was trying to do it from a very America-centric perspective. I once remember talking to a school teacher in Afghanistan who said, I can't understand why they come to us with plans for elaborate schools with basketball courts and this and that, etc., when we would be very happy with a roof, a blackboard, some chalk, a teacher, and some books. And so, if we can get the Beltway bandits, I don't know if there are some present here, my apologies, and the various consultants and everybody who takes the money, we can actually bring down the cost and yet help Afghanistan build itself up and be a practical ally that can bring the Taliban to the point where they feel compelled to negotiate. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who rocketed Afghanistan, who destroyed Kabul in his effort to seize power. First, he got peeled off from Pakistan, which was useful. Pakistan stopped supporting him because they thought he was no longer useful. They switched their support to the Taliban. And then, when he realized, I'm getting too old, I'm never going to have any power, I'm not going to have absolute power in Kabul ever, that's when he negotiated. That can be the template for understanding how you will get the Taliban to negotiate instead of just having negotiations with anybody who says, I am a Taliban representative. Thank you.
Thank you. So from From Ambassador Haqqani, a prescription of prescience, a metaphor of matrimony, and a desire for a more open-ended commitment, and lastly, a disclaimer that the Zadran tribe has stolen his family name. Dan, can you do better?
I don't know if I can do better, but it is heartening, first of all, to see so many people turn out for an event that was forgotten 14 years ago and remains or seems even more forgotten at this point. Certainly, given the very, very few comments that were made about Afghanistan over the course of our presidential campaign cycle, the few public comments that have been made by the White House to date, you would never guess that it was America's longest running war, one where we continue to invest an enormous amount of resources, one where we have already spent $800 billion or more, where 2,400 Americans have been killed, plus countless international forces, and most importantly, tens of thousands of Afghan people, as we saw so tragically today. And especially, I think, today, given the reaffirmation of the sanctity of civilian life and the belief in Afghan government and in the international community that supports it, all of whom were targeted today in this just unconscionable act. So thanks for being here. Thanks very much to Ashley and Jeff for putting together, I think, a very timely and important and cogent analysis of what the options are. And it's heartening to me that I agree in at least some part with much of what's been said already. Certainly, I think there's a degree of overlap between Zal and I in terms of the overarching approach to Afghanistan, and even elements of what Ambassador Haqqani had said, I think are important. Where I think we certainly diverge is that, at least with Ambassador Haqqani, is that what I heard as advice to the president sounds like not only an open-ended commitment, but a potentially endless commitment without a clear idea of, as Zal said, the strategy and what are a distillation of what the U.S. national security interests are in being there, and then how we achieve them. And to think at this point that what we couldn't achieve in terms of leverage by force in bringing the Taliban to the negotiating table at a height of 140,000 troops and close to 100,000 Americans there, that we could do with a few thousand more at the numbers that are in the public domain. If there are roughly 12,000 international forces there now, even if we get up to 5,000 to 8,000, so 20,000, even if it's 25,000, that's a fraction of what it was at its height. And if that didn't succeed in creating leverage for the Taliban, I don't see why this still relatively minimal increase, even though it's a 50–60% increase of U.S. troops, but overall, in terms of the numbers there, would do much to change the underlying dynamic. And as they both have alluded to, and where I certainly agree, we have long said across the military and civilian leadership over the last 16 years that this cannot be resolved on the military battlefield, that it is not the nature of this conflict, given the nature of the insurgency, and that there has to be a political settlement and a political resolution to this. And that, to me, is where we all must stay supremely focused. How do we get there? So to go back to the advice of the president, I think picking up Zal's very good frame, it's first off, what is that distillation of the U.S. national security interests? Why do we remain in Afghanistan at this point? And there is a fundamental tension there between, are we doing it for solely counter-terrorist purposes, or are we doing it to stabilize the Afghan state, or to do a little bit of both? And if it's on counterterrorism, is the enemy just Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, as was defined in the Obama years? Is it now broader in terms of ISIL and Daesh and those that we think could actually pose a threat to the homeland? Or is it the Taliban, which for legitimate reasons we opted not to define in that way, in part because it didn't seem to represent a threat to the homeland. So I think there does have to be, I hear the concern on just continuing to produce reports, but there does have to be, I think, a very clear-eyed assessment of what the threats emanating from Afghanistan actually are, and then defining a strategy that addresses them. And I have not heard that over the course of the last several months. What I'm most concerned about, Mr. President, is that from all that we have heard from public sources and private ones, this continues to seem like a very narrow decision on troop levels. And it cannot be that way for an ultimate resolution to the conflict. This has to be a fully integrated, synergistic, coordinated approach that brings to bear all levers of American power. So that it is in part a military footprint, but it's absolutely a diplomatic engagement one. It's in part an economic one, whether that's nation building or just helping to stabilize the state, however that's defined. It's in part an intel one, it's in part a regional strategy. All of that has to be combined in a very comprehensive and functional process. And I have seen no indication of that happening thus far from the outside. And I'm quite concerned if those other equities are not being represented at the same time, that there's a fundamental threshold issue of whether we increase troops and by how much. In terms of a troop level increase, I think it'd be hard for anyone, as all of us have been involved in this issue for so many years, to suggest that we wouldn't support what generals in the field would advocate for. And I worked closely with General Nicholson, General McMaster when he was there, and would certainly want to be very deferential to what they believe they need. But again, I think it's to what end, and what are we going to achieve with 20,000 international troops that we couldn't ultimately with 140,000. I concur in terms of, I think the greatest weakness of the strategy which we helped implement, which was the deadlines on it. I would hope that in whatever decision is made, that we continue to try to exert leverage by not having an automatic deadline set, at least at the outset, and that it is conditions-based. But I also understand the reasons for wanting to ensure that it wasn't seen as an endless commitment of U.S. resources. So if we then all agree that there has to be a political settlement, I think what your paper does particularly well is to lay out and then dispense with some of the potential strategies. So I concur that on the unilateral approaches, if you take either extreme on an enormous troop surge, like we had back at the beginning of the Obama administration, or leaving altogether, that doesn't ultimately meet our strategic interests. On the regional approach, I think that though you identify key problems with it, that doesn't mean that we can't continue to engage there. And in fact, I think we must continue to help lead that process in a way that we did over the course of the Obama administration in terms of numerous bilateral and multilateral meetings with key regional interests. And just as it looks to me as if the US is abdicating leadership in any number of areas, I think we're also abdicating leadership in that process, and we should be at the center of it. And so how do we generate and so you ultimately, the two options that Ashley briefed on, the kind of status quo plus, and then the political settlement. I concur that the default seems to be to the status quo plus, but I think we all have to do everything we can to energize that political settlement. What I don't think you got into as much in that paper is that there are a broad spectrum of ideas on what a political settlement actually looks like. The ones that Hussein has talked about are having such leverage and such military might that the Taliban would be operating from a position of weakness. I'm not sure how that happens over the course of the next few years at a minimum. And so I do think that we should be looking to incentivize any number of options that we can. We should be casting a very, very broad net in terms of whom we can speak with and how we do this, whether that is, as we sought to do for many years, having a formal Taliban office that we have an official address, whether in Doha or elsewhere, laying out what preconditions would be, having the Afghan government lay out its strategy and plan, because this does have to be an Afghan-led and Afghan-owned process, but I think that they need to articulate as well what that starts to look like. Which other countries or other parties are at the table, including if there's a role for multilateral agencies like the UN or others. And then ultimately, what a sustainable future for Afghanistan can actually look like. I think that has to be the prism that we look to through all this. What is the end goal? How do we achieve some degree of sustainability and stability in Afghanistan? The last few things I'd say is that core to that will be a very, very robust regional effort, certainly with regard to Pakistan. And as one of those State Department diplomats that issued hard messages to Pakistan, I would take issue with some of Hussein's characterization of that, because I do think that this was tried in a very comprehensive manner over a long period of time, and at a point when at various times during the course of the Obama administration, the relationship really sank to real lows because of the differences of opinion and what was being asked of Pakistan. But I think it also has to ensure, as Zal laid out, that there are both carrots and sticks, that though it may be emotionally satisfying to cast Pakistan as the sole undermining force of this, that there are any number of issues that we also have to continue to engage Pakistan on, whether on regional stability issues, on that don't include Afghanistan, on growing extremism and fundamentalism and issues that could well cause a threat to our homeland if left unaddressed in Pakistan, on nuclear proliferation issues. And so, like all else, that this is, that there's a spectrum and that we have to have a fully comprehensive strategy in able to be most effective. And I don't think that after many years of efforts that there has been any indication, as we long talked about changing Pakistan's strategic calculus, that will ultimately be changed by anything other than a Pakistani decision that it's in their interest to change their calculus. And so that's what we need to continue to drive at. And then lastly, in terms of leading the international community, as I think America should and must in Afghanistan and elsewhere, is that means that there's a critical role for key partners. And certainly on a day that, certainly members of the German embassy were targeted in Afghanistan, when they've taken such a leadership position in Mazar, when they have always continued to be among the foremost of allies in this international coalition, that getting into a Twitter war with them is not in our interest, and doesn't necessarily suggest American strength. And same with the Australians, and same with the Brits, and same with any number of others that we have counted on and have stood with us steadfastly. The only time that we have ever invoked Article 5 of the NATO Charter at our interest, and those allies have been steadfast. And so engaging and continuing to lead that international coalition will be key to long-term sustainability. Mr. President.
Thanks, Dan. So I want to go to you, but before I do, let me just imagine that the president or his advisors had a follow-up question, and they were to say, I was taken by Ambassador Haqqani and Khalil Azad's point about Pakistan, and I certainly agree with that sentiment. But I was also taken by, Dan, your point that it's hard to imagine what 20,000 troops would do that 140,000 couldn't. Presumably, we're at this point of indecision because there's a debate. And let me represent the other side of the debate here by asking you, let's take what some of my advisors are recommending as a more prudent course of saving this investment and reinvesting it at home. Something that I ran on in the campaign. The threat has changed. Bin Laden is dead. And I want to put the question to you differently. What is the threat to the United States if we were to disengage and let things run their course, given that we've made a reasonable investment and given Afghanistan a reasonable chance to consolidate itself? What's the real threat to the United States if we take that course? Ambassador Khan.
3 quick points. The real threat to the United States is that Islamist extremist terrorism will continue to have a home even outside the Middle East as a result of failure or withdrawal from Afghanistan. Afghanistan and Pakistan together become one theater, and because of its geographic location, it continues to play havoc with Central Asia, with South Asia, and potentially East Asia. And America has interests in all those places. Plus, given the large number of people that move from that region into the United States, it could also be a threat to the American homeland. To subsidiary points, it's easy to say what will 20,000 accomplish, what 140,000 didn't. Here's the difference. The 140,000 went with a very clear deadline. And I'm not saying that there can't be an internal deadline. Of course, there's no point in having an endless commitment. But announcing a deadline has a very different effect on an enemy like the Taliban. In fact, I know for a fact that on the Pakistani side, the knowledge that the Americans will come out. Look, Musharraf in his book writes that when the Americans went in after 9/11, I thought they will be leaving in 2 to 3 years. That's what his calculus was based on. So it's as important to understand the other's calculus as it is your own. And I believe that the real threat will be that that region will again become a terrorism center, and that threat is not worth allowing.
And if he were still unconvinced?
Well,
So.
Of course, you could always do that to withdraw President Obama. For example, he did that in Iraq. And I think he regretted it later on that he did that. I think Iraq is a good lesson for President Trump to think about. We're back there at a bigger number than perhaps could have precluded the situation getting where it is if we had continued to stay at a much lower number. Afghanistan, in my judgment, is the beneficiary of Obama's mistake in Iraq. It's much harder to do that in Afghanistan because that has happened. That happened. If it had been reversed, maybe Iraq would have been the beneficiary. You face, I'd say, the president, very difficult choices. There's no doubt about that. Now, it's true that Al-Qaeda has been weakened in Afghanistan, and there's no question about that, and that's what we did under both administrations, Bush and Obama. Their leadership was decimated. But some of the things that we did was because we were in Afghanistan, and we couldn't have done them easily if we weren't there. And if you remove that, these people are looking, ISIS and others are looking, where are ungoverned spaces where they can go to? I give the example of Iraq. So the problem that has been reduced can increase if we abandon Afghanistan. Now, I think the question that Dana has raised, what you can do with 20,000 or 10,000 that you couldn't do with 100,000, besides the mistake of putting timetables on them that made by the Obama administration, there is a different reality now in Afghanistan. The reality is that forces that didn't exist when we did some of those local forces, now they do exist. The effort to break them has not succeeded. They're losing ground slowly, but they haven't been broken. Imagine if we allow the force to break by disengaging. what options will we face then? Do we go back with 100,000 if there is no Afghan force? Or do we live with the sanctuary? I think the key part is Dan's point about a political settlement, I think is very valid. And the question is, what are the conditions that can be more favorable to a political settlement than less favorable to a political settlement? That's where the space for discussion, in my view. The conditions that are more favorable, in my view, and as I think Ashley correctly said, we can't be 100% sure about these things because the other guy has a vote and their beliefs, their calculus, all are important that we must understand. And I appreciate in your point that we have to understand the others that are in this game, not be fooled by our own wishful thinking about what they might or might not do. But is that I think it's more likely a political settlement if the adversary believes he cannot win. That's one important. And two, it's for not believing that not only the military support for Afghanistan a little more is important, but also coming to this understanding with the Pakistan. I think that would help. We talk about regional and all that. That's very important, and I support that. But let's be clear: not all regional players are of equal importance. And for this issue, the regional power that really matters is Pakistan. And I do think that what is in this report that's interesting, which we haven't highlighted, is that we also change something else, which is that we engage the Taliban ourselves. We have so far I've done it occasionally, but it has been not fulsome. And it has been, we've had issues with the Afghan government about, wholly Afghan-owned and Afghan-led. And I think that what is being proposed is slightly different. And that's sort of some adjustment that could be beneficial in my view. It's worth thirsting, but it can be only beneficial in the context of showing up as the military leaders are doing. That the balance doesn't shift, because as the balance is beginning to shift, it's become more complex. Iran is seeking to engage the Taliban, the Russians, the others, because they see that the Taliban are becoming a bigger factor that they must deal with, and there is the issue of ISIS. So the limited increase to prevent victory or change in the balance against the Taliban, with pressure, more in positive and negative incentive with Pakistan, engage with Pakistan, with opening also with the Taliban. I think it's a package that could put us, again, as Ashley has said, no guarantees, put us in a better place than if we disengage or if we stay where we are. Staying where we are, in my view, is not an option. It's going to deteriorate. So either you go to increasing somewhat or getting out, and getting out is extremely dangerous in my view for U.S. national security interests. So that's the prudent option is, I think, what this report and what at least my judgment about where we ought to be is right.
So let's imagine he's not convinced. He gives you the final word, but he says 140 characters or less.
Oh, well, I can give you a bumper sticker.
The 140 characters or less would be everyone counts in this decision making. But I have not heard yet any kind of compelling narrative on what the additional troop strength, whether it's 10,000 or even more than that, does other than arrest the deterioration. At the end of the day, General Nicholson described this as a stalemate, and what we hope we get back to with increased troop strength is back to a stalemate. And the question is, for how long and to what end, and what is ultimately sustainable from that? In terms of, I don't think that the Iraq analogy is an apt one here, primarily because it was the Iraqis that chose not to enter into status forces agreement with us.
Well, we can talk about that.
I'm not sure I want to take you on that one. But
I'm not going to do the Iraq.
We won't do Iraq there. But
that's another day.
But to the point of having continued.
Do we have a set of forces agreement now with Iraq?
But to the point of investing in Afghanistan, what we do have in Afghanistan is a very credible, engaged, pro-international community a government that would like us there. And so do we continue to execute on that for some of the reasons that we've laid out? Again, over the last year or two, we continue to hear about threats like ISIL or Daesh, and I think it's notable that the enormous ordinance that was dropped in Moab a few months ago was specifically targeted on ISIL. Does that mean that we think that there's an increased threat there, that we are redefining our interests there? We've not heard anything to necessarily state that, but and does that present a threat, a national security interest, or a threat to our homeland in a way that the others didn't? We'd have to see. I think the failed state argument is always a compelling one, though then gets you back into the same discussion that we've had for many years in many different theaters on is that also is a remedy of that more effectively nation building, and then again, how do you utilize economic interests and a range of others? I would just add, in terms of the counterpoint to this, which we have not heard floated here, is that increased troops also brings increased threats to us solely by the fact that they are there. And so if some of these groups do not pose a threat to us in the homeland or even more regionally, but only pose a threat to us as we continue to increase forces, are we not just continuing this cycle of violence by continuing to invest more there? And then lastly, what I would say is that we continue to talk about the right conditions for a political settlement. I think that at any time, and again, we're even on the basis of military assessments with an increase, no one is talking about breaking much out of a stalemate for the foreseeable future. I think any time could be the appropriate time for a political settlement, but it has to be a very energized one, an effective one, and that means difficult conversations. It's going to be an ugly process. It has to mean not just, Ashley, to one of your recommendations, not just an empowered ambassador in Kabul, but an empowered State Department and a functional interagency process that instructs that ambassador and helps to ensure that they deal with all those in the region. And the region is a critical piece of this. Yes, Pakistan and the Pakistan policy will be particularly important, but given the increase in Russian engagement with the Taliban, of Iranian engagement with the Taliban, all of these are not clear dichotomies. We can't decide that Iran may have an interest in Afghanistan that would be helpful for them to speak with then, but refuse to speak with them about a whole range of other issues. And it's a tough neighborhood. I mean, it's Iran, it's Russia, it's China, it's India and Pakistan. And for those reasons alone, there has to be a very, very robust and empowered diplomatic aspect to this.
I agree with that.
So let me do this, Ambassador Haqqani, because we've got a number of questions backlogged here. So I want to get the audience engaged here.
I just have an open-ended question for everybody, including the audience.
Please.
Why hasn't there been a political settlement? I mean, 8 years, that was Richard Holbrooke's intention, political settlement. Let's go over it.
Learn from it.
Learn from it. So I think that's important to think about it. Look, I want a political settlement as much as anybody else. I just know the history, and I know how it is. I'm the only one in this room who has actually spoken to Taliban leaders at the very beginning.
You're not the only one.
Well, sorry. And so the Taliban leaders, they have a particular worldview and a way of engaging, and it's not going to be an easy process, but it should be continued. But we should learn from why it didn't happen. It's not. Let's not pretend there's a political settlement waiting and we are not seizing on it.
Right, no.
Let's do this. Let's go to the audience who's been patient. Please wait for the microphone and tell us either your question or are you convinced? Yes, ma'am, in the white jacket here in the front. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you so much. My name is Nazira Azim Karimi. I'm correspondent for Ariana Television Network from Afghanistan. As you guys mentioned, today was very sad. Unfortunately, this is the only month, which is Ramadan. More than 200 people has been killed. I got so many messages from Afghanistan, from the social media like Facebook, Twitter, and people was crying, and they knew that Ambassador Khalilzad will have a speech today. And they asked me specifically for how long Afghan people should suffer. Although experts said Afghan war will be one of the longest war around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman right next to you, Rachel, in the tie there.
Thank you very much, Raghubir Goyal, with India Globe in Asia Today. My question is that Osama bin Laden is dead, but violence and bombings and killings of the innocent Afghans and international community is still going on. And I'm sure President Trump is asking the same question, who is behind and how we can end. My question is that many high-level Afghan officials were here and they all blamed that Pakistan is fueling the fire. I don't know how much you can answer and where can we go from here and what role you think finally India should play. Thank you.
Yeah, let's capture the gentleman with the glasses in the fifth row there, Rachel, and then this gentleman in the front, and then we'll turn to the panel for all three of those questions.
Thank you. Marvin Weinbaum, the Middle East Institute. You know, I still have trouble with the idea of what is a political settlement. And I think that this is something we talk about as the goal here. For example, and I think Hussein alluded to this, are we really sure that they have the same end state vision? It's very important. Do we think that that process would be anything other than years in accomplishing? Do we have years? Do we think that there is a credible interlocutor? It's much more complex now than it was 10 years ago in that regard. So is there another option that was not, rather than having, on one hand, defeating them or negotiating with them? And that is the idea here that we should not be looking for a grand bargain, that that's not attainable. So it's not reconciliation, but it is reintegration. And that's the best hope we have. And I think Hussein alluded to that too, that what we're really doing, and I think we do have a strategy, and I think that strategy may be a long shot, but that strategy is buying time. Buying time for the Afghan government to be able to, in terms of security, economics, and the political, to be able to put its act together. So what the additional troops do is maintain what is our maintenance strategy. It's simply to keep that going, that our generals have said we can't do that job of maintenance without a few more thousand troops. Again, I say it's a long shot. But given the complexity that I think I've said here, isn't that the only shot we have?
Thank you. And let's, Rachel, if we could turn to this gentleman in the front, and then we'll take all three questions to our panel. Yes, sir.
First, I want to congratulate the panel. This has been a really tour de force. In 2008, the Atlantic Council issued a report signed out by Jim Jones, who was then chairman as a former NATO commander, that began, make no mistake, NATO is losing in Afghanistan. Subsequently, we had to soften that a bit. But there were three reasons that we were losing. First, failed government in Kabul. Second, an economy based on drugs and corruption with no means to sustain it. And third, as Hassan said, a failure to understand Pashtunwala and the culture of Afghanistan. I would argue those same three flaws persist today, and perhaps even maybe bigger, despite our attraction for Ashraf Ghani. It seems to me that you've got two choices. One, a permanent commitment to Afghanistan that's going to take 30 years possibly or longer, which comes at a time when the U.S. military is retooling to fight a big war against a so-called peer competitor and wants to shed itself of these responsibilities and is not getting sufficient funding to be able to keep up with its current needs, or withdrawal. You're stuck with those two choices. How then do you make the decision?
So, three questions. India? the utility of reintegration and buying some time? And then third, how do we get past our cultural ham-fistedness in the strategic sense? Who wants to take India?
I favor increased cooperation between us, India, with regard to Afghanistan. I think we're moving toward a world of dealing with bigger challenges in Asia. We need a balance of power approach to Asia. And in that balance of power grand strategy, I think a close U.S.-India relationship is very important, and I think we should support. And one area where this cooperation can manifest, and there can be can manifest itself and can add real momentum besides military cooperation in the Indian Ocean or balancing the rise of China, I think is in Afghanistan, where it can be materially manifested, and there can be burden sharing, if you like, because if part of the cost, the reason some have got heartburn about doing what we're doing, how can the cost be reduced without abandoning our objectives? And we need to look at the game, at the sort of the chessboard broadly. And India, I think, is a target of opportunity in that. We have very compatible interests with them. Now, I think one of the perhaps incentives it could, with regard to Pakistan, this complicate things. We need to be conscious of that. And maybe in our discussions with Pakistan, this can be also a factor as to what the consequences of persisting in this way, if they don't recalibrate, could be. So that I want to say a word on Marvin's, if with your permission. I agree with you, Marvin, that we need to look at negotiating a deal with the Taliban headquarters, so to speak. But that doesn't preclude reaching out to kind of elements inside. The two are not incompatible. In fact, I think we may not, I have to, since I'm not in government, I use the word may, I've seized the opportunity on that front fully in the aftermath of the announcement of the death of Mullah Omar. Because I think usually in Islamic movement, succession is very problematic. The choice of who replaces a big leader can create factions, and I think it in fact did. And I thought there was a lot of opportunity at that time. I think there may be opportunities. So a robust effort, covert and overt, with Afghans and our people and others, because there are a lot of others who have also got connections and still I wholeheartedly support.
Other views, little r integration? Dan?
Sure. On the India point, I would just say, certainly it was a mainstay of my time, almost 7 years at the State Department, to engage India very actively, that they were part of our 6+1 discussions, but we also had not only direct bilateral discussions frequently on Afghanistan, but an Afghan-U.S. India trilateral. And we've always commended India for the amount of assistance and engagement they provided on economic issues in particular. And I have, I was always impressed with India's restraint and recognition that moving beyond economic assistance to the potential for military assistance could make an already fragile regional situation that much more fragile. So I hope that they continue the strong investments on the economic front. In particular, and refrain from the others. I think Marvin's question is a really interesting and important one, because there has been a lot of focus on reintegration over the years, and to Hussein's point on knowing the history, unfortunately, to date, that's been one that just hasn't been successful. There were the British and the Japanese funded reintegration efforts. There were many kind of DDR-related efforts, and these were fairly of de minimis impact. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue them, and I agree if there are others like Hetmakjar and that there can be outreach to and that can ultimately be brought in, we should continue that. But I don't ultimately see a process of very, very low-level reintegration, bottom-up, that results in any sort of comprehensive or sustainable resolution. For that, I think we still do need to really try to intensivize a broader reconciliation process. And to your question on, is there an interlocutor for that? I would say our experience was that we think that there was. I think that the experience of Sergeant Bergdahl's release and other instances we had, the effort to set up an office in Doha, so there was an address when we came knocking, or others, and that we had a channel that was valid, was an important one. But there absolutely has to be a discussion, and a very hard discussion, on what this actually means. What is Afghanistan going to put on the table? What is the U.S. prepared to put on the table? How are we going to guarantee that continues in a manner? And I would say that the three fundamental red lines that the U.S. laid down for the end process for reconciliation back in 2010 are still the same ones. And those should be that the Taliban renounce violence, that it break from al-Qaeda, to our question on use of failed states, and how it can be a direct threat to the homeland, and that it embrace the Afghan constitution, including rights of women, and that the protections that and significant benefits that have resulted in Afghanistan over the course of the last 16, 17 years can seek to be safeguarded.
Quick response to Dr. Ullman's comment. Look, I think that the Afghanistan-Pakistan theater is actually part of the peer-competitor concerns of the U.S. military, or reorientation of the military, because if the peer competitor is China, then China's heavy investments in Pakistan and acceptance of Pakistan's desire to have Afghanistan as its sphere of influence would definitely play into that as well. So I don't think that the U.S. military's desire to reorient itself will apply to the Afghanistan-Pakistan theater, although it may apply to other places where it thinks that it's being stretched unnecessarily.
A two-finger on this one. I think it would be a strategic error on the part of our military that if it abandons the lessons learned, the capabilities to do counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and just focus on a big war kind of with the peer competitor, because the rivalries before we get, God forbid, to the big war would happen at these lower levels. And we've paid a high price over many years to learn lessons, to acquire capabilities. And if we swing away and from those, I think we would pay a high price for it. So I hope that they will learn to do both peer competitor and to be able to do counterinsurgency and counterterror. Those are the real world issues. I don't believe that they can just do major wars as a planning tool. And I used to be the head of planning in the Defense Department. I think the civilian needs to instruct that they need to do both major regional contingencies, which would be peer competitor focused, and counter-terror, and the numbers one can argue with, but it would be, I think, it would be a failure of leadership or learning the wrong lessons if they are instructed only to prepare to do two major regional contingencies nearly simultaneously and force plan for that purpose alone.
Thank you, Zhao. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but if you've been convinced of anything, perhaps it is that this is indeed a very complex issue and there are no easy answers. So please join me in thanking Carnegie and Ambassadors Haqqani, Khalilzad, and Feldman.
Excellent job. I think we did. Excellent.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yes, of course.
We get together.
My office is about 2 doors down.
Don't
Right
let
at
them do
DuPont.
that.
My home is right by your home, Chevy Chase, DC. I know. I would love to. I've never been invited.
Give me an email.
Happily.
And we have to work on the budget. We'll actually get somebody to change their strategic.
I agree. I agree.
I hope we can see, and after all my frustrations, that that's the way to do it.
Jeff. Hi. Yes, yes. Yeah, you did. All right, good. Where are you? You're at, are you a VO? No. You have VOA? Okay, all right, good. Did you, someone emailed me yesterday about an interview, but I don't think it was you, at VOA. I don't remember. I was out of town yesterday, so I didn't get back to it yet. But
maybe after my
We ran into each other in the
love to do that. I would love to do that. Let's aim for mid-July. I'm traveling. Okay, sure. So when I come back, that'll be great.